I have to admit, I'm just amazed at you, at the numbers of people that come out on a Sunday morning to an Adventist church. Maybe we ought to start Sunday services. All right, we've talked about discipleship. We've defined disciple. We've used some suggestions as to how you start implementing some of this. So you have some fodder to talk about on your church board now, don't you? Or you need more stuff? If you got something to talk to your church board on? Okay. And remember, you committed to do that. Now, as we move into this further, I need to say something right here. Our present church structure is not designed to support what we're asking you to do. Did you hear me? Yes. Our current church structure supports a few people in ministry while the rest watch. That's our structure. Now, is the structure sacred? No. What must we do then? We've got to change something to support every member in ministry. Now, I'm not going to give you that information. I'm going to give it to your pastors tomorrow. We're going to talk about how you structure the church to support everybody in ministry, rather than a present structure that supports only a few in ministry. So your pastor's going to get something you don't have. And hopefully they can share some of this with you, but I can't get everything in 2 days. Now, I want to reiterate something else here before we go on. I asked you earlier if you believed Ellen White was a prophet. And you said? Yes. I asked you if you believe we should take her seriously. And you said yes. And I said, you sure? Because we're going into something right now that I told you yesterday was going to scare the pants off you. That time has come. Hold on tight. When we look at our present church, rather than a church geared for the accomplishment of Christ's mission, it appears more to be a church that's organized to babysit the saints. Each church demands it has a pastor over it to take care of all the things that need to be done. Right? To minister to us. If the pastor doesn't visit, you complain. Your chief responsibility is to come to church, sit in the pew, and pay your dues. And if you do that, you are considered a faithful member. And in some places today, you don't even have to pay the dues anymore. Just sit. In some places, you don't even have to show up very often. And you stay on the books. We've created a low-commitment church. Where the chief responsibility is to attend on Sabbath morning between 11 and 12, not even to Sabbath school anymore. Just come to church. I don't know how it is here, but in the States, Sabbath school has really gone down. Where we study the Word together. Our chief responsibility is to sit and be entertained. That's not New Testament Christianity. We sit, we get entertained, and then we go home and we have the pastor for lunch. And if he didn't do something right, we make sure we talk about it. Somehow, am I right? I'm talking about America. If the shoe fits, wear it, you know. But This is not New Testament Christianity, folks. For some reason, this does not sound like, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. By the way, that's a misunderstood text if there ever was one. Because with most people, that conjures up a picture of the church on a rock, a mighty fortress around it, and no matter how much the devil batters down, it stands firm. That's not the image. The image there comes from the ancient world, where the enemy would have come and attack the cities that were walled. And there was the most vulnerable place was the wall, was the gate, because it was not as thick. And they would come with their battering rams and batter down like this until finally the walls would crash. They come in and they conquer the city. While the people in the city were shooting arrows and throwing rocks down on the people battering the walls. The text, I lost it. Is it back? Okay. It just seems like I have no power. It's still on?
Yeah.
It's very,
Just a little bit higher.
okay, are we better now? There, that's coming back. Okay. The picture that is drawn from the ancient world of the battering ram battering on the gates. And when Jesus says, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail. It's not that the church is on the defense mode, the church is on the offense. The church is the one attacking the gates of hell. And believe me, you live in the gates of hell. And God says, get out there and attack. Go on the offensive. The church is going to stop being on the defense. That's the image that Christ has given. That we are an offensive army, and we're attacking the gates of hell, and they're going down. Christ is victorious. But our present church doesn't sound like that. That wasn't the way it was in early Adventism. One thing I've learned through the years is most of our problems that we're facing today are answered in our history. It doesn't mean we replicate the past. But if we go back and look at our history, we'll find out how our pioneers did things. And from that, we learn principles that we can apply today. Not replicate, but principles we can apply. How was the early Adventist church organized? Well, first of all, we were an anti-organizational movement. That's hard to believe today. We didn't believe in organization, period. To be organized was to become Babylon. And because we had no organization, we were Babylon. Total confusion. We couldn't even hold title to property we owned because we were no legal entity. And so we'd build a church and it would be held in the name of the elder. That worked fine until the elder left the church and took the building with him. And by the 1860s, it was very obvious that this wasn't working, and so under the guidance of James and Ellen White, we were led into organization. But the brethren said this: if we're going to be organized, then let's go back and take a serious study and look at New Testament Christianity and how it was organized, and let's organize the church in harmony with that. So they commissioned a group of people to study organization in the Bible. I think it's helpful to understand where our system came from. So they organized this group, and Jan, when I was doing my research, I came across a paper in the archives of the James White Library, there at Andrews, where a paper that Jan Loughborough said was the paper that was produced as the guiding paper for the organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I was fascinated to read that. What I was fascinated about was the scholarship. This paper could have earned a PhD. It was that good. Liberal use of Hebrew and Greek. Sometimes we think our pioneers were ignorant because they weren't formally educated. They were self-educated, many of them, but they were educated. They knew what they were doing. As I read through this paper, I came to a place where they talk about organization in the New Testament church. And that there are two kinds of leaders in the New Testament church. Number one, those called by God. The apostles and the evangelists, that's what they named them. Apostles were called by God. They were what we would call professional clergy. Then there were those who were local and lay and appointed by the church. And then they named them. Elder, deacon, pastor. And that's where my eyes popped out of my head. Pastor was a local lay position? That was the early Adventist understanding. Now, if you look at the Bible, the word pastor appears only one time. And we really don't know who it was. Most people think it was another local position similar to the elder and the deacon. But we really don't know. We only have one text, Ephesians 4, that mentions pastor. So we don't have a lot to go on. And yet we built the highest role in the church, pastor, around one single verse in the entire Bible. Therefore, when they organized, the early Adventist church made a very interesting decision. They decided to organize a church without pastors. All clergy were either church planters, evangelists, or administrators. No church had a pastor over it, period. Zero. And that continued for the first 80 years of our existence. That comes as a shock to a lot of people today. The early Adventists built a church on a discipleship model of church, where all the members were involved in ministry, all the members were engaged, and therefore they did not need a pastor to pamper them. Even the Battle Creek Church, our largest church, didn't have a clergy over it. Oh, they did have a pastor. His name was James White. He was also president of the General Conference, head of the publishing work, head of the medical work, and his lay job in the church was pastor. That's a whole different way of doing church that boggles our mind today. Now hold on to your seat. I'm not saying kick your pastors out yet. But I am saying, let's take a look at our history. Our problems today are related to our past history. And only as we understand how God's led us in the past can we move into the future. But the early Adventists founded a church built solidly on the discipleship model of church, where every member is involved in ministry and everybody shares and everybody's involved in evangelism. That's a far cry from where we've come today. This was the model of church from our very beginnings up until the year 1900. By the year 1900, we had reached 70,000 members in the world. We thought we had arrived. 70,000 members, no small little people anymore. We got 70,000 members. And we began looking around us and we said, you know, all the other churches have got a pastor that lords it over them. Why do we have to be different? We want to be like the other churches. We want a pastor. Sound familiar? And so, beginning in 1900, we began putting pastors over our very largest churches. That received tremendous opposition from two people, A.G. Daniels and Ellen G. White. By the time you get to 1920, A.G. Daniels is no longer president of the General Conference. Ellen White is dead. Nothing stems the tide. And we began putting pastors over every church. And we see a dramatic drop by 2/3 in the growth rate of the Adventist church in North America. We virtually stopped the growth of the Adventist church by the move to putting pastors over churches. Now, if that shocks you, were you aware of this? Most people aren't even aware of our history here. Now, again, I want to say, I'm not saying get rid of the pastors. Even in early Adventism, there was a place for them. But we may need to change their job description. I want to show you some of the evidence. And this is James White talking about those very early days and what they did with pastors. He says, we have no settled pastors over our churches. Is that pretty clear? When I've read through the historical evidence, this one is a very clear statement. We have no settled pastors. We don't have one settled pastor. We have 0. But our ministers are all missionaries, as were the early ministers of Jesus Christ. Consequently, they are most of the time deprived of the blessings of home. For Christ's sake and for the salvation of their fellow men, they sacrifice the society of dear ones at home. They go forth into a cold, selfish world and wear out their lives in preaching unpopular Bible truth. God bless them, but they must be sustained. And God has made it the duty of the church to support them as they go on their mission of love. So James is clear. We don't have any settled pastors, but we have a lot of people out there itinerating, and they need support. Because up until this time, we had no system to support clergy in ministry. The first plan we developed was called systematic benevolence, and the preachers all called it Sister Betsy. Because Sister Betsy is who paid them. Well, I got paid today by Sister Betsy, you know. This is short for systematic benevolence. Later on, we move into tithing. However, this is a very interesting thing. Why is it that in the Adventist church, we do something that no other denomination does? When the members pay their tithe, we send it where? To the conference office. Why do we do that? Every other denomination, the local church pays their pastor. And they may support the higher organization, but in the Adventist church, the conference pays the pastor, and we send all the money to the conference office. Why do we do that?
So everyone gets their share.
Oh yeah, so everybody can have a same salary. That sounds so communistic.
It's nice.
But it's got absolutely nothing to do with why we do it. Think about it. Why do we do it? What's that? Oh, to support the missionary. No, that's got nothing to do with it either.
It used to be historically that the conference office was the only ones who knew where the pastors were, and they had to distribute funds.
Yeah, you're close here. What did we just discover? How many pastors were over churches in the early days? None. So we developed a system that supported an itinerant ministry, and therefore, because the local church didn't have a pastor, we sent the money to the conference office, who would pay the clergy who are not pastoring churches but out planting new churches. Our entire structure was designed to support a mission movement where most of the clergy were out there evangelizing. What we have now done is taken this system that was designed to support a church planting movement, and we use it to support a church nurture program, and now have no money for church planting. Are you tracking with me? This is what we've done. Only as you understand our early history do you understand the reason we send it to the conference office. And I'm not suggesting by any means that change, that we send it to the office. Maybe we need to change how the office uses the money. Are you ready to kick me out yet? I'm just sharing you history here, that's all. This is the way it was in early Adventism. Look on here. Paul was not what is now called a settled pastor. Yet at Corinth, he continued a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. These early teachers of Christianity remained in one city or place until their testimony aroused the people. And they brought out a body of believers and established them in the doctrine of Christ. Things were then set in order so that these disciples could sustain the worship of God. And then these ministers would pass on to a new field of labor. These churches were not carried upon the shoulders of their ministers, but were left to sustain the worship of God among themselves. Occasionally they would pass through and visit the brethren to exhort, comfort, and confirm them. These were frequently seasons of weeping and rejoicing. This again is who? This is James. It's not Ellen, but it is kind of close. And he's describing what they saw in the early church. In the early church, the plan was you go out, you plant a church. You'd raise up a body, you might stay there for a while, a year and a half. You thoroughly establish them, disciple them, teach them how to exist on their own without clergy, and then you move on to another place. That's how the early church did it, biblically. And what I found interesting is I'd already done my Bible study on this and seen this to be the case in the early church. And then I came across all these statements and found that I wasn't originating anything. The pioneers already knew all this stuff. We had just lost it in 100 years. That's James. We needed clergy. By the way, we were different than other movements. Mormons, for example, don't have a clergy. Jehovah's Witnesses don't have a clergy. We didn't have a clergy over churches, but we had a clergy evangelizing. And that's why our growth surpassed both Mormons and JWs, because we had both things going. We had all the members involved in ministry, and we had a clergy who are out there starting new work everywhere. Churches that have been planted, she says. No great centers are to be made as at Battle Creek. Yet there will be some important churches established and meeting houses provided in large cities, favorable to accommodating the believers in each locality. There should not be a call to have settled pastors over our churches. Oh, now wait a minute. Who said this one?
Ellen White.
Oh, I didn't get to the end yet. Let me read it. There should not be a call to have settled pastors over our churches, but let the life-giving power of the truth impress its individual members to act, carrying on an efficient missionary work in that locality. As the hand of God, the church is to be educated and trained to do effective work. Its members are to be the Lord's devoted Christian workers. The church is too one-sided. Who said this? This is Ellen White. It's written in 1901, I believe, is when this was written. When we first started putting pastors over our large churches, what did she say? There should not be a what? Last line. There should not be a call to have what? Settled pastors over our churches. Now, Ellen White did not say we should not have pastors over churches. She said we shouldn't even be asking for it. That's pretty strong. You still believe her? It's getting weaker, isn't it? I mean, you really believe she's a prophet? Do churches here call you and say we want a full-time pastor?
No, we do it as much as we can.
But do churches request it? Yeah.
Expect it.
Yeah. Read them this statement next time they call. I mean, that's what it says. I'm only reading what she said, folk. I'm not even interpreting here. Ellen White saw this as an issue of discipleship. That to put a pastor over a church, she says, weakens the church. Let me go on. The gospel is to go to every tongue, nation, tongue, and people, And ministers are not to devote their labor so entirely to the churches which already know the truth. Both ministers and people lose much by following this method of labor. When the pastor spends all his time working for the church, who's losing? Everyone, the pastor and the people. That's not God's plan. Who says this? Who says it? Ellen White. And what is she? Well, you said it. Both ministers and people lose much by following this method of labor. It is by engaging in earnest work, by hard, painful experience, that we are enabled to reach the men and women of our cities, to call them in from the highways and the byways of life, she says. Do not depend on the ministers to do all the work in your church and neighborhood. Oh, but that's what we paid them for, isn't it? Do not depend upon the ministers to do all the work in your church and neighborhood. The pastors must do what? Seek the lost sheep. And you, the church, must do what? Help them. And how do you help them? While the ministers are called to labor in other parts of the vineyard, the people of God are to have life in themselves. By the way, what would you call life in it? To have life in yourself. Self-sufficient what? In order for that to happen, you have to be what? What have we been talking about, folk?
Disciples.
Be disciples. They're to have life in themselves. They're to be disciples. Speaking to each other. I said, this is how they carry on their worship without a pastor. Speaking to each other in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in our hearts and making melody unto the Lord. While you should respect the minister for their work's sake, you must not trust them as your Savior, but build yourself up in the most holy faith. When you assemble in the house of God, tell your experience, and you will grow stronger. While you speak in meeting, you are gaining an education that will enable you to labor for others. Now hear what Ellen White's saying here, folks. She says, when the pastor's gone, do you have somebody get up and read a sermon? Do you like to listen to read sermons? Now, I don't want to hit anybody, but do you like to listen to somebody that can't even preach? What happens when that happens? Yeah. Does Ellen White say when the preacher's gone, have anybody just read a sermon or can't even preach a sermon? What does she say do?
Tell your experience.
Tell your experience. And you will grow stronger. Now, we'll talk later about this a little bit more. They have what they call the social meeting. We'll define that a little bit better later. But it was that was the meeting they had on Sabbath. They met for Sabbath school, and they met for a social meeting, not a preaching service. It was exceedingly rare for an Adventist church to have a preacher on Sabbath. It would happen once or twice a year, but that was it. The rest of the time, the members cared for themselves by having a meeting where they shared their life in Christ together. And by the way, these were not dead old testimonies. Well, 50 years ago when I came into the church. No, this was what happened last week. It was vibrant, it was clear. I read in one instance where they had a social meeting where there were 100 testimonies in 1 hour. Wow. Then that had to be going boom, boom, boom. That would be exciting. It wasn't long, drawn out, boring stuff. So, when you assemble in the house of God, tell your experience. Share what's going on. Share your life in Christ together. And then she says, when you speak in meeting, you're gaining an education that will enable you to work for others. Oh. You know, today it's possible to come to the Adventist church from cradle to grave. And never once will you ever be asked to get up front or stand up and tell about your life in Christ. Am I right? You can just sit and listen all those years. And then we wonder why people never share their life in Christ to their friends. if I can't share my life in Christ among my own church brethren and sisters that I'm a part of my fellowship, then how am I going to share it with my neighbors? I think one of the biggest things that has killed every member witness is the loss of the testimony meeting. In those days, it was expected. You had to say something. And she says here that when you share in that meeting, you're gaining an experience that will enable you to labor for others. Maybe this is why our evangelism has become ineffective today. We rely on the preacher to say everything and just to be convinced with the head knowledge because we don't share Christ intimately with our friends and neighbors because we don't even do it in church. All right. God holds these ministers responsible for the souls of those who are in darkness. This is the preachers, he said. He does not call you to go into the fields that need no physician. Establish your churches, the understanding they need not expect the minister to wait upon them and to be continually feeding them. Woo! What if we put this into practice? Is this too revolutionary for you? Are your pants still on? This is strong meat. I admit that. It just happened to be the Word of God. Am I right? Yes. Oh, those are getting very weak. Is it the Word of God? Yes. Oh. Should expect them to continually feeding them. They have the truth. They know what truth is, the members. They should have root in themselves. They should strike down deeply, that they may reach up higher and still higher. They must be rooted and grounded in the faith. Now, this is Ellen White's response to the call to stop putting pastors over churches. That's 1901. You look at the timeline. Doesn't say a lot about this before that because that was the way it was. Now is being challenged. And the servant of the Lord is up there saying, no, let's not go down this road. This is not what God's called us to do. We're not to be like the other churches. God's called this church to be different. But the lure of the world is hard to overcome. And now we've inherited a church. We had nothing to do with this. We've inherited the church. By the way, every part of the world that abandoned this model of church is not growing. Every part of the world that has not abandoned this is growing rapidly. And we say, well, that's because it's the third world and this is the developed world. I'm not so sure about that because we found that when we put into practice some of these basic principles into the Western world, we end up with a growth rate higher than the third world. The problem is not the problem, and that we like to say, because that's easy, we can't do anything about it. It's too hard to reach these people. The problem is not out there, the problem is in here. We're content to make our religion one where we come and sit and then go home and come back next week and sit and go home. We are not actively engaged as missionaries for Jesus Christ, and that is what God has called this church to be. And wherever every member of ministry is in place, this church soars. I told you when I was in Wichita, Kansas, we had over 300 people in ministry. We're baptizing 90 people a year. That's a 12% growth rate. Third world is 7%. I know from my own personal experience that whenever we get this kind of philosophy in place, the church soars in growth, even in this world. And Wichita, Kansas, by the way, is Kansas. Mid-America, one of the hardest places, they say, to work in America, is in the middle of the country. Heavy Lutheran population. Oh, by the way, I think that's what you got here too, isn't it? My greatest success in evangelism that I ever had was in that kind of territory when we put this kind of process into place. Not even eliminating the pastor. I'm not talking about that, folks. I'm going to be very honest with you. We're going to look at principles here. The principle is non-pastor dependency. Even if there's a guy there, we're not dependent on him. The churches are dying. This is Ellen White again. The churches are dying, and they want a minister to preach to them. Oh, yeah, we're dying over here. Just send us a preacher so we can have some life. They should be taught to bring a faithful tithe to God that he may strengthen and bless them. They should be brought into working order that the breath of God may come unto them. Now notice this. They should be taught that unless they can stand alone without a minister, they need to be converted anew and baptized anew. They need to be born again. Wow. We need to rebaptize 3,000 people here. Obviously, Ellen White's being hyperbole here. I understand that. But do you get the point? Was this a small matter? And by the way, I'm not giving you all the quotations there are. There are hundreds of quotations. We could make a whole book on her philosophy on this area. I've just chosen a few to put up here. But this is pretty strong stuff. And this was in the book Evangelism. Well, I gave you the original reference, 1901. But it's in the book Evangelism. What is Ellen White really saying here? That if they have to have a minister to depend upon, if a church to exist needs to depend upon a pastor, then she says they need to be converted anew, born again, and baptized. What does that mean? This is a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual issue here. It's not just an organizational issue. We're talking about conversion. And the church is not to be a weak sister. It's to be that mighty fortress that goes out to conquer for Christ. Well, this is not Ellen White. This is A.G. Daniels in 1912, when he's still combating this push to put pastors over churches. And he said this at a general conference session: "We have not settled our ministers over churches as pastors to any large extent." He's describing the present reality in 1912, 100 years ago. In some of the very large churches, we've elected pastors. That's what started in 1900. But as a rule, we've held ourselves ready for field service, evangelistic work, and our brethren and sisters have held themselves ready to maintain their church service and carry forward their church work without settled pastors. And now notice, and I hope this will never cease to be the order of affairs in this denomination. For when we cease our forward movement work and begin to settle over our churches, to stay by them and to do their thinking and their praying and their work that is to be done, then our churches will begin to weaken and to lose their life and spirit and become paralyzed and fossilized, and our work will be on a retreat. I call him Prophet A.G. Daniels, because we did what he said we shouldn't do, and we got what he said we would get. Is it clear to you that the early Adventists thought pretty strongly about this matter? I find to most Adventists, we've been 100 years into this Catholic model of church. I might as well call it what it is, because that's where it originated. We have a hierarchy that does everything and you're dependent upon them. That's the Middle Ages model. It's called Catholicism, where the pastor now assumes a priestly role. Well, we wouldn't dare call him a priest, but we expect him to do what priests do. We can't even have a meal together unless the pastor prays over it. I was in a place one time and they didn't know what to do because the pastor wasn't there. Who was going to pray for the meal? Man, it's really gotten bad when you can't eat till the pastor's there. We believe in the priesthood of all believers, don't we? And that means We don't have a priest, we are a priest. And God has given us this tremendous responsibility to go directly to God. And we think primarily priest means I don't have to go through somebody else, I can go straight to God. But the priest had two functions. Number one, he interceded. And number two, he performed ministry for people that they couldn't do. When Jesus died on the cross, he made every believer a priest. Therefore, we don't have to go through anybody to go to God. And we are all called to be involved in ministry. There's no ministry that we cannot get into. Ministry belongs to the people. Ministry is not a function of clergy. Ministry is a function of laity. Ministry belongs to the lay people. And when clergy step in and do the work of ministry, they are robbing the people of that which God has given them to keep them happy and keep them solid in the church. What if our dear pastor, what's your name?
Wolfgang Stefani. Wolfgang Stefani.
Wolfgang. Okay. And you're a pastor here. Now what? You're a pastor here. Oh, okay. What if you get up here next Sabbath and you announce to the congregation that the following Sabbath we're going to have communion. And you announce to the folks that you'll be here on Friday night to hear their confession. What do you think would happen in the next week? I guarantee you two things will have happened. Number one, either he will have repented in sackcloth and ashes, or he would no longer have a job, because you'd have all called the president and got him fired. Am I right? We feel that strongly about our pastors aren't going to be preached. But if Wolfgang gets up and tells his people, you know, last week I gave 20 Bible studies and I visited so many people, and what do we say? Anybody going to call the president? No. We're going to rise up and call him blessed. Both are equal violations of the priesthood of all believers. But we've come to despise one, intercession. We accept that. But the fact that every member should be in ministry and he should not steal our ministry from us, that's perfectly all right. Because we've lost the priesthood of all believers. Ministry is the function of all the people. Now, is it my job as pastor to give all the Bible studies in the church? No. Do I give Bible studies as a pastor? Why?
To train those to disciple the members.
Yeah, but why do I give Bible studies? Because giving Bible studies, whose work? Belongs to who? Clergy or laity?
Laity.
Belongs to laity. So if I give Bible studies, I'm doing the work of laity. Why?
Makes you feel important.
I got to give you another statement. All clergy, we said all lay people are ministers, right? All ministers are laity. Because what does laity mean? Laos means the people of God. And to say, well, this distinction between clergy and laity, I'm sorry, not lazy, but laity, is an artificial distinction that's not biblical. It came in during the Dark Ages. It is Catholic. There is no such distinction. We're all the people of God. And ministry is the function of the people. So the pastor does Bible studies. Why? He's laity too. But that's not what he's paid for. You're not paid to give Bible studies. Now I'm in trouble, aren't I? All right, let me try another one. It's the pastor's job to visit all the church members. What do you say?
No.
I want to hear this loud.
No.
Pastors hear this. It's not his responsibility. Whose is it?
Everybody.
There are 75 passages in the New Testament that talk about member care. We're going to look at them this afternoon. Every one of them is one another. Mutual self-care is the way people are cared for in the New Testament. Now, does the pastor visit church members?
Yes.
Why?
Because he's part of the ministry of God.
Yeah, because he's involved. He's laity too. One more. Is it the pastor's job to visit people in the hospital?
Should be everybody. Not always. Everybody.
I'm really getting you squirming. Is it his job? Is that why he's paid?
No.
No. Whose job is it?
Everybody's.
It belongs to the whole church. Does the pastor visit people in the hospital?
Yes.
Why?
Because he's a member of the church.
Because he's one of the laity. And what in the world is he paid for? I mean, we just took away everything that he does.
To disciple.
What's that? To train the church members. Ephesians chapter 4 is very clear. The job of clergy, apostles, evangelists, pastors, teachers, is to equip the saints for their ministry. That is the clergy function, and that is why a clergy is hired. That's why the clergy is paid, to train you. They're supposed to work themselves out of a job. I'm going to bypass that one. That's too much of a hot potato that I don't want to get into. I'm retired. I am officially can do that, see. I will say, take a look at the text. Go therefore and make disciples refers to who doing it. Is it just the clergy? Pretty self-evident if you look at the evidence. Because go therefore, make disciples, baptizing them. For church order, yes, we need that. But that's hard to prove biblically. Oh, did I finish reading this? I got carried away. Yeah. Oh, our church will weaken and decay and become fossilized, which is what has happened. This is James White. Again, not Ellen. But it shows you how the early Adventist, he was General Conference president, by the way. So pretty authoritative. In no way can a preacher so prove himself as in entering new fields. There he can see the fruit of his own labors. And if he be successful in raising up churches and establish them so that they bear good fruits, he gives to his brethren the best proof that he's sent of the Lord. How do you tell you got a call to ministry? Raise up a church. Now, this statement continues. I've given it as two separate statements, but it's one statement. There's nothing in between. And it continues. Some who join the Seventh-day Adventists commence at once to preach to the brethren, many of whom are far in advance of them. That's an interesting statement. There's this new young guy who said, man, you got ministerial potential. You can be a preacher. You come preach to us. We know more than you do, but you preach to us. And James White says, and our brethren often err in urging such to spend their time in preaching to them. Instead, this is what you do. Let such ministers first be suitably instructed by those of experience in the message. Then let them go out into new fields, trusting in God to help and success. And when they shall have raised up churches and shall have properly instructed them, then those churches will support them. This was before tithing came in. If they cannot raise up churches and friends to sustain them, then certainly the cause of truth has no need of them. And they have the best reason for concluding they made a sad mistake when they thought that God had called them to teach the third angel's message. Wow. How would you like to have him as president of South Australia? I want you to get a picture that these early Adventists felt strong about this model of ministry. Very strong about it. And very quickly looking at some charts here. And these are North American figures, if you'll pardon me, because Australia gets settled with Adventism much later, and so I don't have those kind of statistics, but my research focused on North America. The first four bars are decade. Each one bar is a decade. It shows our, this is the increase in members for every pastor in the denomination. And you can see we were averaging about 12, because by the way, the early Adventists didn't even count baptisms. So you can't do this by looking at the number of baptisms. There's no record. All they kept was, here's our membership at the beginning, here's our membership at the end. What's the net increase? And that's what I have to go by to make this consistent throughout the decades. Notice the first 4 are between 8 and 10 sessions, net increase per pastor per year. That's the 1900. Then we switched and go to the Catholic model. What do you notice happens? Isn't that a dramatic shift? We made this choice of suddenly switching to having pastors over churches. And when it first happened in the 1900 decade, it went way down. Then it bounced back up and held around 3, 4, or 5. But it's almost 1/3 of what the rate was back when we had the other model. One can only wonder what would have been the membership of the North American division if we had never abandoned the model. Doesn't it make you wonder that? The year 1900 is a dividing line for Adventists, and which switches from rapid growth to low growth. It didn't happen because the population shifted like they have today to secular and non-secular. It shifted in response to a change in the ecclesiology of the Adventist church, where we became Catholic instead of biblical. And I can say what I want now, you know. So I call it Catholic. It is. So we've copied. This looks at the number of churches per pastor. That doesn't mean the pastor had that many churches. I just took the number of churches and divided the number of pastors. And you see it again and again, as we got older, we kept putting more pastors per every church. And this looks like the number, this is more church planting, how many churches got planted per decade. But this one is most interesting. How many pastors are needed to raise up one church? Way back in the beginning, it's 11, 4, 9, and 6. And then we changed the paradigm. And by the time you get to the 1990s, it took not 3 pastors to raise up a church, it took 125. That's a dramatic shift. And again, you see the numbers going up once you pass the 1900 period when we make this change. That's the information. It's shocking. The question is, what do we do with it? And let me make sure you're with me again. You all still believe Ellen White? Even after what you read? Do you think that we in South Australia should do something with the counsel we've been given? You sure? Now, by the way, do not go home to your churches and say, we went to the seminar this weekend and we learned to get rid of the pastor. I did not say that. I'll make that very clear. I got to still speak to the pastors tomorrow. I better not start. Do you have any questions? I've tried to make clear as I've gone through this, I'm not talking about replication. We've gone too far, folk. Our present society is not the 19th century that lent itself better to itinerancy than today does. Today, itinerancy would be an almost impossible situation. That's how they applied the principles in that era. But I think we've got to take a look at the principles. What's the principle? Number one, the health of the church was at stake. And what's very emphatic in the many statements we didn't even read, that the church needs to be a healthy church. And this was not creating healthy churches. You see that even with A.G. Daniels, saying we'll become fossilized and be on a retreat if we do this. So one of the most basic principles is the church needs to be in health by discipling people. Number two, non-pastor dependency. If we have a pastor on a church, we should not be dependent on the pastor. If the pastor's there, his primary job is to do what?
Disciple.
Train us, equip us. The train, equip a model of the church, of the pastor role, is exactly what the New Testament says it is, and what Ellen White is advocating. It is in harmony with the principles that we've been given. Number 3 is mission-centeredness. Our church must be centered around the accomplishment of the mission. And therefore, we must not tie up so many resources in maintaining the saints. You remember I said that yesterday? You didn't know all that was involved then. Those are the 3 principles that I gather from this. The health of the church, mission-centeredness, non-pastor dependency. Whatever model of church we end up developing in harmony with our heritage and the counsel given us by the Spirit of prophecy, based on principles, we must create a church that's centered in mission, that has been fully discipled, and that is non-pastor dependent, with the pastors primarily training and equipping us. Does that make sense? Definitely silence. Does it make sense? That's the route. Do you want to go that route? We've got to do it on principle, not replication. I want to make sure you are hearing me. I'm not talking about getting rid of the pastors and every church no longer has a pastor. Are you with me? Not saying that. That was how they did it. But we must form a church that is centered in mission, fully discipled people, and therefore have good health, and is not dependent upon the pastor. What I want to share with you is 4 possible models as to how that can be done. Not saying there's only 4. I'm just trying to get the creative juices flowing so that you can do something with it. Okay? Do you understand what we're doing? This is suggestive. Number 1 model is the easiest to do. It's the traditional church in the non-pastor dependency mode. Now, what do I mean by traditional church? Just that. What most of us are in. Church where you come every Sabbath, sit in the pew, the pastor preaches, and you go home, and that's it. You may do a few mission activities once in a while, but basically, it's if the pastor's gone, you're in trouble. Now, this is the easiest one to do, is to change the role of the pastor from one of caregiver to one who is a trainer and equipper of others. So you'd still have the located, settled pastor over a traditional church, but in this case, the pastor would direct the program. He would oversee the care of the membership, and notice my wording there. What does he do to the membership? He oversees the care. He doesn't do the care. And he directs the evangelistic advance. What's the difference
He's an overseer.
from the current role to this one? Yeah, he's more overseeing and leading out in it and equipping people and training them and this kind of thing rather than doing it all. The present model, he basically does this. Now, what I have found in North America is if we can get back even this far, well, that was a loud mic, we get a better growth rate than the third world. Did you hear me on that? Just getting back this far, not even all the way back, we get that kind of result. So what's his job description? He may be seen as a CEO in this traditional paradigm, but more and more time is spent training and less doing ministry. In other words, he's just working himself out of a job. I keep saying he. Do you have women pastors here in Australia? Okay, she too. Good. Proud of you. The pastor would not immediately abandon the traditional role as caregiver, but as people in the church are trained in these areas, they are released to that ministry, and the pastor can move out of the area. I hope you're seeing what I'm saying here. This can't be a radical shift. You go home next term and say, folks, the pastor's no longer going to be visiting us. We're going to have to do it ourselves. all that's going to do is create an uproar. Understand that. Here's a suggestion. Why not get a group of people in the church to simply call the members and say, just call them from the church to see how you're doing, and anything we can do from the church to help you, and how's it going spiritually? If there's a major issue, it's referred to the pastor. He continues to do what he does, but they're starting to get used to a layperson in the church being concerned about them. By the way, how do you get better care? With a pastor doing it all? Or with more people involved in the caring process? Yeah, more people involved. All of a sudden people feel more cared for. Just because somebody called them. Because usually the church only calls me if they want my money or want something to do. Right? But how they're just calling to say, how are you doing spiritually? How can we help you? We have to transition out of the care model of the pastor into member care. One of the easiest ways to do this is get people involved in small groups. When people involved in small groups are cared for automatically. That's cared for. And when in our small groups, when something happens to somebody, before the pastor even get there, the members of the group have come in and helped the person when there's a crisis. That's the way it ought to be. The way it ought to be. So we're saying gradually move out of the role. As you're educating and training people, you can move out of the role. Acceptance of this model by the traditional church can be accomplished only as a mission mindset is restored to the church. That's the most important step. And this is where we make a big mistake. We have to go back from this seminar and go immediately in there and go to the meat of the word. What I'm giving you today is the mark of the beast in an evangelistic series. Do you give that the first night?
No.
If you gave mark of the beast the first night, what would happen? You're not ready for it. If I started out yesterday afternoon with this, I'd been run out of town by now. What did I do yesterday? What did we talk about? The passion of God, the mission of God. Why did I spend all that time on that? I wanted that so solidly in there that I could get here. But if I hadn't done that, I could never have gone here. Please hear me. Do not go back to your church and go here. This is for your information so you know where we need to go. When you go back to your church, what are you going to talk about? The joy of the Lord, the passion of God, the command of Christ. Deal with mission. Once the mission mindset is in place, you can move to these things. If you go here before you get the mission mindset in place, you will kill it. So if you want to sabotage this, go back and talk about what we're talking about today. You'll kill any attempt to move the church in this direction. Our intention may be good, but that's how people respond. I've had pastors go through seminary and they got out and said, well, I tried this and the people rejected it. I said, what did you do? Well, I told them what early Adventists were like and we needed to go there. I said, would you establish a mission mindset first? What's that? Totally forgot it. It's so easy to forget it. Don't do like one pastor did. He took my book, Revolution of the Church, walked into the church one Sabbath morning, handed the book out to everybody and said, you better read this because this is what we're going to do. That's not the way to do it. Not the way to do it. Okay. So don't forget that this is so crucial. I need to move on, but I'm almost hesitating to emphasize it even more because it's so crucial. This model still will work primarily, however, in churches with over 100 to 150 in attendance. This is not a small church model. You do this in a small church, it's over-dependency. This works in, well, we would call larger churches. I'm talking about over 100, 150, it can work. How many are in churches that are that big? Ooh. How many, you have less than 100 people coming to church? Okay. Yours is the next model. It doesn't work in the large church, in the small church. It will immediately create dependency. But here it will work. Because ideally, if you're in the trainer-equipper mode, you need a trainer and equipper for every 150 people in attendance. That's a staffing formula for this kind of model. Once you move over 150, you got to add the second one, because that's all one person can handle in training and equipping and supervising that many people. You don't hire another person to do things, you hire a person always for equipping, because this is an equipping model of ministry. Okay, the small rural church, or just small church for that matter. We looked at the large church type situation where you still have a pastor as the trainer and equipper. And we're really going to have that here too, but it's done a little bit differently. We face a real challenge. I don't know how it is here in Australia. It may be out in the outback some. But in North America, we have a lot of rural churches where there are very few people. I remember one time I was asked to hold an evangelism meeting in Farmington, Washington, population 125. Nearest town, 12 miles away, well, you convert, 12 miles away, and the population was 400. And the conference says, hold a meeting there. Oh, by the way, the membership of the church was 100.
That's good.
130 people in town, 100 members on the books of the church. And I said, who in the world am I going to evangelize there? The jackrabbits? I mean, the work is done, I thought. We were there, we had a meeting. The church membership was 102 when we started. When we finished, we baptized 28 people. And the membership of the church and the population of the town was identical. Never happened anywhere else I've been. But these small churches, that's an unusual situation. The small rural church is quite a challenge for us. They get better pastoral coverage than the large churches. Let me explain what I mean by that. In a large church, you may have one pastor for 150 people. In the small church, it may be in 2 or 3 churches, but there's only 75 members in those 3 churches combined. So the ratio is one pastor for 75 people versus one pastor for 150, twice that in the large church. So they get better pastoral coverage. Most of these small churches are plateaued and declining. I'm talking about North America. I really don't know here. The main problem is people have moved out of the small towns and they moved into the cities. And Adventism has been primarily a rural movement. We've had 2/3 of our membership in rural areas and 1/3 in the urban areas. But today, 80% of America is urbanized. And so we've had these small churches all over rural America that are dying. And the town is dying. And sometimes the best advice is the last person that leaves turns the lights out. And we don't know what to do with some of these small churches. I found one place where we had 2 small churches. One had 3 people coming, the other had 2 people coming. And they had a full-time pastor for 5 people. That is sinful. Meanwhile, there was a city nearby that had no Adventist church with a big university there, but we could not afford to put a pastor there because we had him over here with these 5 people. I think we have to do some serious evaluation of what we're doing in allocating in some of these areas. Pastoral allocation formulas need to be determined by the size of the harvest, not by the existing membership. What do I mean by that? I don't know if you have this down here, but in North America we have these pastoral staffing formulas. So much membership, so much attendance, so much tithe equals a pastor. And if you have those things all figured, you can have a pastor. The problem is, it only is concerned with the existing membership. Now, you get a church that say got 25 members in a major metropolitan area where the potential, the harvest is great, may not deserve a full-time pastor based on the existing membership, but based on the harvest, it needs one. Versus another church of 150 members in a rural area where there's very little potential, yet they qualify for a full-time pastor and the other one doesn't, because we don't take into account the harvest. We need to become harvest-centered in our allocation of resources. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So what can be done? This is a little bit radical, but this is what the third world does. Create districts of 15 to 20 of these churches. Well, I've got to be careful. That's about all your churches in South Australia. But 15 to 20 of them in a district, which is creating a similar system to the third world, where the pastor has 15 to 20 churches. We're just trying to say, hey, they've got it together, it works there, and even works in areas. For example, I was down in South Brazil, which is as Western as America or Australia. And people are affluent and everything else. And I preached in this pastor's church on Sabbath. And the church sat about 300. There was 400 people there, packed to the gills. And I said to the pastor, is this because I'm the foreigner and I'm here? He said, oh no, this is the way it is every week. I said, well, you need to start a new church. I mean, you have no room for new people. Oh, he said, we just started one 6 months ago. And it's filled all back up again. I said, well, how many churches do you have? 6. I said, how many members do you have? 2,000. That boggles our mind, doesn't it? And that's in a Western situation, and they're growing by leaps and bounds even in that society because they operate on this model rather than our care model. So that's why I keep saying that it's not a matter of it's easier there than it is here. It's not easy there. It's that every member is involved in ministry. 15 to 20 churches, I think, would be easier to pastor than 2 to 5. Why? Because when you have 2 to 5 churches, people still expect it's possible for you to do everything as a pastor. But when you get 20, everybody knows that's impossible. And they start to come to life and do it. So maybe we need to consider doing some larger districts. What would such a district look like? Much like the churches of early Adventism. Sabbath services would consist of a traditional Sabbath school. And the worship service could be conducted in several ways. You know, if you got somebody that can preach, they can preach. If you can beam somebody down by satellite today, if you need to, in a church, or have an old-fashioned Adventist social meeting, which is more what the early Adventists did. That is model number 2. Small church, where the pastor is available to equip the leaders, but they take care of themselves, but the pastor's a resource that can come in and help them. But that frees up, do you see what I'm trying to free resources. And what are we going to do with those resources? Put the money in the bank? We need to do what early Adventists did. What did they do? They sent people out to evangelize, to start new churches. Do you need new churches in South Australia? No. Can our existing churches handle the harvest that God's going to send? No. Do we really believe what God says is going to happen to this church in the end time? If we do, we ought to prepare for the harvest that God says is coming when the latter rain comes. We can hardly get our present membership into most churches if they ever all showed up. The only reason we exist is only half the membership shows. There's a conference in North America a few years ago now. They had 5 churches in the conference where the attendance was 5 people or less. And the conference committee said, we can't continue to supply pastors to all these churches with so few people. And so they recommended that the churches close. Now understand, in Adventist governance, the conference cannot vote a church out of existence. The church itself has to vote itself out. That's our policy. There's more local power than we sometimes give us credit for. And so it only could recommend. Now, they had tried everything with these churches. They had meeting after meeting. They had poured money in there trying to get things right. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. So that's why they finally said, we just need to close them. But oh, did the people react. How dare you close our lighthouse on the hill? I mean, some lighthouse hadn't baptized anybody in 20 years. But they said, we pay our tithe. We demand a pastor. The Congress said, I'm sorry, we just can't afford to send a pastor. You don't produce that much tithe. This went on for a while, and finally the churches came and says, okay, don't give us a pastor, but let us stay open. We'll care for ourselves. Well, you couldn't argue with that. 4 of the churches agreed to that. The other one absolutely insisted it have a pastor, so finally they put the 5th one in under another district where a pastor would care for it. And the other 4 were left on their own. 1 year later, the attendance in the church that had the pastor was still the same faithful 4 or 5 people. But in the other 4 churches, the attendance was now between 20 and 25. And the only thing they had done was remove the pastor. Now, that's not because the pastor was bad. That's why I'm saying this view. You cannot put a pastor over a little church. It kills it. There's another couple of churches. Pastor had these 2 churches in the district. One was a church of about 125, and the other was a little church that had just 5 or 6 people coming. The pastor would go over there every week and he'd preach to the 5 people. You know, they sat one to a pew, so they could spread out in the church. Every week he preached it. And finally they came out and said, Pastor, this is kind of ridiculous. You coming over here preaching to us every Sabbath? Let us take care of ourselves. You just handle the big church. Well, you can't argue with that. So pastor's happy. He now had one church to be concerned about. He didn't worry about the other one. He didn't have to go over there. He said, if you need me, call me. 6 months later, there were 30 people attending. The pastor heard about it. Wow, got 30 people over there now. I'll come preach. So he came back to preach. In 6 months, it was back to 5. Got nothing to do with the pastor's preaching. It's just that dependency mode that we get into when we have a pastor. It does not work in the small church. We really need to go back to what Adventism did in 1900, 1920, when they put pastors only over the larger churches. And then in these small ones, another way to handle it is grouping them, as we've said, into groups that take care of it. Well, I'm getting close, but I'm not going to make it. Let's look at number 3, see if we can get through this in a couple minutes. And that number 3 model is the cell church. What is a cell church? Envisions the planning of churches that are totally independent of a pastor, yet there would be a resident pastor. A cell church is a church organized around groups. It's not a church with small groups, it's a church of small groups. You catch the difference? You can't belong to this church unless you're in a small group. All life would take place in the groups, including pastoral care. They might come together on Sabbath for joint worship. But the life is in the groups. This is a very high commitment church. We've had a few of these take off in Adventism, not a lot, because it's of such high commitment. Because you have to not only be there on Sabbath, you have to be involved in a group, and you have to be involved with an accountability partner. And if you're a group leader, there's another meeting each week. It's very heavy, and that's why it's been a little problematic. But it works. The groups then pastor the people. So it's a non-dependency model. One study took a look at, in North America, the cell churches baptismal rate versus the baptismal rate of all the other churches, which is about 3 to 4%. But the baptismal rate of the cell churches was 16 to 17%. So this was a model that was very productive, but very hard because of the commitment. The pastor's role here, he facilitates the group leaders. That's his main job, is raise up leaders. The main difference in this kind of church and the multi-church district is that all the groups are part of one church. But it's like he's got 20 groups in the church. It's like he's got 20 churches in that small church model. They just happen to be in one church that comes together on Sabbath. This model, I do think, has tremendous potential, but we'll have to work on it because it takes a lot. Have you had any cell churches in Australia? Yes. You got a few of them? Have they worked out all right, or you had problems with them too? You had some of the problems. It's just such high commitment that in this day and age, people don't have that time commitment. And we're finding that's where the real problem was with them. All right, it's noon, so I can't do the last model. And then we'll go into our next section. But we'll finish this model after lunch. And then we're going to look at what would the church look like today if it lived up to what God's ideal is. My book, Revolutionized Church of the 21st Century, is where we're going.